Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NGO CSW 66 Virtual Forum. This is a parallel event entitled Gender Equality, a way to generate actions that positively impact climate change. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to post your questions and comments throughout today's event. We have speakers delivering their speeches in English, Spanish, and French, so please use the interpretation channels to hear your desired language and follow the instructions in the chat. If you need any assistance, please message WW Production in the chat, and we will do our very best to help you. Thank you so much for attending this event, and now I'm delighted to hand over the floor to SIW President Ouafa Hajji to open the event. Ouafa, over to you.
Merci, Julie.
Thank you, Julie. Good afternoon, everyone. I am happy and honored to open this parallel event of the SIW discussing gender equality, a way to generate actions that positively impact climate change. Topics that are essential for us, and I think it's a vision for us in SIW. Very briefly, I would like to present the Socialist International Women, SIW. It is an organization gathering 140 women's organizations, so socialist women, and we are, of course, under the umbrella of the Socialist International, and we are members also of the observers of the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. And in the SIW, we love to debate, to discuss, in order to promote a better visibility for women in politics, but not only, in other sectors of society. And we believe that reaching gender equality can only be positive at all levels of the society for every single country. If we want a society, an equal society, a fair society, that isn't possible without gender equality. And before sharing our vision, SIW vision on the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, I would like to first have a few words about Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine. We are very sad when we look at the news, and we hope indeed that very quickly this conflict will come to an end and we will have a peace in the world so we can all move forward in our search for gender equality. I would also now like to share our SIW vision on climate change. We are all aware of climate change, and our planet is suffering. We've already seen the damage at different levels, from the weather to the oceans. And the pandemic, it's a consequence of this climate change, of our lifestyle, bringing a lot of issues for our planet. This pandemic was also maybe a way to understand better the whole situation, to understand that we need to change our behaviors as countries, but also as individuals. We also need, when we talk about changing behavior, to adapt, and we have to also understand that we need to insist towards all the major contributors of the pollution so they change their behaviors. And it's also our responsibility as individuals to try to pressurize these major polluters. So for women, the consequences are even heavier. Let me just give you an example. Examples are numerous, but if we talked about displaced populations in areas where here there's in rural areas, very often they have to go further and further to get water, and also they are more impacted by diseases related to pollution. They are also more exposed to toxic pollutants and chemicals, having, of course, a negative impact on their health. So how to fight against climate change? If we don't all gather together, and let me remind you that women represent 50% of the world population, then it will be difficult. We cannot change behaviors if we don't all gather together, all women, and beyond just women. It is not possible today to fight against the climate change without women in leading positions. If women are not involved in the design, implementation of these policies, how do you want them to feel involved and committed to this fight against climate change? So for SIW, gender equality is an opportunity, a chance, an asset to develop further our vision we need to be aware that without women, we won't go very far and we will not be able to fight against climate change. The document we've prepared is available to you if you'd like to read through. You can actually send us your email and we'll be happy to share this document prepared by SIW, and this is our contribution today. And our meeting today is dedicated to gender equality, a way to generate actions that positively impact climate change. And do not hesitate, as I said, to email us and we will email you back this document. This is a document you can see here on your screen. It can be a reference for the whole international socialists, but also for all women organizations. This vision statement is consistent with our vision from the very beginning. We've been very committed to gender equality. And the International Women's Day, March 8th, was actually born here within the SIW, thanks to our first president, Clara Zetkin. And we'd like to also thank her and thank every woman fighting together or individually for women's rights. So let me now move on to our agenda today to celebrate this new meeting of the SIW. We have with us Christie Morreale from Belgium, Vice President of Socialist International Women, and she will be our first speaker. I know, Christie, you are extremely busy with some sessions in the parliament, So you'll be our first speaker, and then we will give the floor to George Papandreou, president of the Socialist International. Then I'll have my friend Elback Zeinabou, hi Zeinabou, with us today. Nesrine Rebai, gender expert from Tunisia. Welcome, Nesrine. Shazia Marri from Pakistan. And Isabel Allende from Chile. So our speakers today will share their thoughts, their expertise on gender equality and climate change. And we will be able to then, of course, debate all together. And we'll be able to also take some questions. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to type your question in the Zoom chat. Do not hesitate if you've got comments. We are a democratic group and happy to answer to all questions. And without further ado, Christie Morreale, Vice President of the SIW. It's a real pleasure to see you, Christie, here. You are also Vice President of the Walloon government. And it's a real honor for us to have you today, because you're extremely busy. You are the Minister of Employment, Training, Health, Social Action and Social Economy. So indeed, you are very busy. And you're also Minister of Equal Opportunities and the Women's Rights Socialist Party. Christie, you have 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Christie, you have the floor. Thank you, Ouafa. It's a real pleasure here to meet you, and I do hope that it's the last time we have to meet online. But I do believe that it's always very interesting to have these meetings, and I think it's very dear to my heart to be able to continue here our exchange and communication month after month. So as you said very rightly, Ouafa, this is about gender equality, this is about climate change, and those are very important topics. We've seen a report recently where we saw, and in your report you were very clear, and your vision statement, that indeed we can't be complacent, we absolutely need to act. Challenges are multiple, and we need to act now to avoid a human catastrophe. We need to acknowledge that we could all disappear if we do not protect the environment, as climate change is impacting everyone. Consequences, of course, are felt by everyone, but even more by girls and women. Women in general find themselves in more precarious situations, and this is why within climate change we need to acknowledge that there are also a lot of inequalities, including gender inequalities. Therefore, I think that the different actions that need to be implemented need to acknowledge this inequality and try to close this gap. I believe we can work on gender equality and on climate change. I believe policies and strategies need to acknowledge this difference and need to also relate these two topics. I believe gender assessment is required so that measures and actions to fight climate change also contribute to close the gap between genders. So we need to have a global approach and recognize that vulnerabilities exist. And in Europe, we've had to face difficult situations, such as, of course, the pandemic, but also what we had to face in Belgium last summer with major storms and major floods. And I believe that those are cumulative risks related to climate change having an impact here on the most vulnerable. So this impact of climate change needs to be acknowledged and needs to be here taken into account in all our debate. And Ouafa, you were right. Very often, women are underrepresented in leadership positions. Despite the fact that women represent 50% of the world's population, we are still not always taken into account when it comes to taking decisions. Therefore, I believe that for decision making, very often you find men around the table, and it's a shame because, as you said very rightly, for women to be involved, they need to be involved from the very beginning in the process, in the designing solutions, in implementing these solutions. So we need to work on clear participation rules for women and to also guarantee that gender equality is part of the different policies so that we can also be agent of change as women, as young girls, to be able to change this visibility. And we can do it if we manage to involve them from the very beginning in all the actions and strategies to fight the impacts of climate change. And talking about the representation of women also in leadership, I think we need to mention large companies, those companies that are listed on the stock exchange. And when you look at the board members of these companies, women are still a minority. So this is also a type of violence, as this is not recognizing the position of women, the leadership of women, and this is also an economic bias. During the pandemic, we've also seen an increase in domestic violence. This was extremely sad, and this shows how much women are vulnerable and in difficult situations, how they are usually more disproportionately impacted. Ukraine, I think you've mentioned Ukraine also, Ouafa. I believe that in a context of a humanitarian crisis, very often again, women, girls will be disproportionately impacted, and we need to be very careful about how these women will be protected in this situation of conflict. We also need to talk about the different rules in different countries where the reproductive health and sexual health rights are not always respected. And here I'm also thinking about Ukraine, where, you know, in this type of situation, very often those are the first rights that are denied. And we need to talk about education. Women are disproportionately impacted as well with a lack of education. The girls are always the first ones to be withdrawn from schools when there are difficulties within the household. So we clearly need to take all these elements into account when we're talking about gender equality. And we've all worked from home for a while, and for some of us still working from home, and we've noticed clearly that the burden of house chores was mainly on women, and we've seen these difficulties also when it comes to access to resources. And in Belgium, we've seen that this was a real difficulty. And we need to implement these integration strategies so that women can be part of the rebound after the pandemic. And we need, of course, to fight against the horizontal segregation in the labor markets. So all those are challenges to reach gender equality. So we need to acknowledge all those, and we need to fight against those to close gaps. The rights and the different issues facing girls and women need to be a priority for all governments, such as the fight against climate change. We need, of course, to focus on all countries. Of course, some of the most industrialized countries are also the countries that have the highest CO2 emissions, and also that's where in countries where women have some of their rights denied, such as sexual health and reproductive rights. So I think we need to have a very holistic approach. Thank you. Thank you very much, Christie. Thank you for this first speech. I think you here illustrated all these points that are extremely important. And you're right, we need to be holistic, and we can't forget that this is an overall and overarching here situation, including a lot of different challenges for gender equality, but also a lot of challenges for climate change. And that both are related, and that actions and policies implemented to fight climate change have to include here this gender equality assessment. And thank you also for mentioning Belgium, you're right, and mentioning all the other developed countries. And without further ado, I will give the floor to George Papandreou, Mr. President. I think you're very famous. You are the president of the Social International. I mean, we know each other for a while. You were Prime Minister of Greece, and you are a famous economist. So let me just give you the floor. And I'm looking forward here to your speech. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Ouafa, dear comrades, and thank you for your kind words, Ouafa. I had to become an economist very quickly when I was dealing with the financial crisis, which still is around, of course. But this UN session on the status of women takes place at a very bleak moment for the world, a bleak moment for women and girls. We are still suffering from the pandemic of COVID-19 and its consequences on women, as Christie mentioned, but also, as you mentioned, Ouafa, a wake-up moment to the consequences of the climate crisis. And now, of course, the terrible war in Ukraine, which has created an additional huge humanitarian disaster. Over 3 million people have already fled from Ukraine, looking for asylum in neighboring countries. We've watched the endless long lines of women and elderly people carrying their most precious possessions in their small suitcases. Around half of these who fled are children. Women and children arrive in a foreign country with few assets, no social network of friends, and therefore face threats of human trafficking, exploitation, and sexual violence. We've seen this again and again in conflict situations, and we progressives in the world stand and act with solidarity towards them. As the war continues to rage in Ukraine, the consequences will be dire for the world, impacting food prices, shortages of staple crops. This is being felt in Europe, but even more so in the Near East and North Africa region, spreading to the world's most vulnerable countries, including the Horn of Africa. The United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, has warned us that as this conflict escalates, so will global poverty and hunger. A quarter of global wheat exports come from Russia and Ukraine. 40% of wheat and corn from Ukraine go to the Middle East and Africa, places where hunger is already present, and further food shortages or price increases will push millions more into poverty. Even before the conflict, spikes in the fertilizer prices last year contributed to a rise of food prices by about 30%. And Russia is the world's largest fertilizer producer. A nightmare in the making for poor, small-scale producers and rural communities. Of course, some fear that because of the energy crisis and dependence on Russia's resources, the climate crisis will be forgotten. I think we need to advocate the opposite. Renewable energy is now more needed than ever and is a hope for fewer geopolitical games and conflicts. And as Christie said, in Belgium, but also here in the Mediterranean, we had wildfires, floods, storms, much more evident of the climate crisis. A usual mistake is to separate the fight against climate change from the fight against poverty and inequality. In fact, poverty and climate are linked. While the climate crisis hits us all, it hits the poorest and most vulnerable, such as women and children, much worse. A key point I need to stress is the key role of women in designing, approving, and implementing policies. Concerning work, for example, recent research from the McKinsey Global Institute finds that if women were to participate in the economy identically to men, they would add as much as $28 trillion, or 26% to annual global GDP. In a few words, this would mean the combined size of the current US and Chinese economies. Concerning political decision-making, quite a few studies show that countries with higher representation of women in the political sphere are more likely to set aside protected lands and to ratify multilateral environmental agreements. So they are much more influential as stewards of our environment and agents of change, as Christine just said. In the SIW vision statement, you rightly underlined that women play a vital role in dealing with disasters by effectively mobilizing communities in the different phases of the risk management cycle. And we're witnessing a dangerous increase in natural disasters due to climate change. Unluckily, we face gender-based barriers across the major pillars of international and national policy processes on climate change. And if we don't mobilize our whole societies in this huge and difficult transition to sustainability in a both just and participative way, we will not be able to make it. So we need to ensure women's essential participation in designing effective climate crisis policies, from education to economy. It's imperative. I myself have just written up a report in the Council of Europe on how participative processes are a crucial factor in fighting the climate crisis. Climate change actions need to be based on consultation and participation of women, respecting and including women's issues, needs, and contributions. They must be integrated horizontally across the planning and execution cycles of climate change policies and projects throughout. In conclusion, I believe that opportunities like the CSW 66, enabling the United Nations, governments, and NGOs to share challenges, experience, and solutions on a wide basis of gender equality issues, this provides a needed format for moving forward in an inclusive and coordinated way. And of course, Ouafa, the vision statement and work of the SIW must be seriously taken into account. And I congratulate your work, because your success is the success of us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you for your kind words on the work of the Socialist International Women. You know that the Socialist International Women is inspired by the leaders of Socialist International. We work together a lot. We have a committee, a gender committee with the Socialist International, and we both are chairs of it. So I think the next Congress could be gender equality for Socialist International. So we will work on that so that it's the case next time.
Definitely.
Parce que justement, le fait
Indeed, the fact that the Socialist International is egalitarian will be very important to involve women further in our countries so that they are, as you say, involved in policies so that they can be part of writing them with men, and they need to be present in the implementation phase as well. Like you said, the crisis that we have known and that is still here following the pandemic had a lot of repercussions, and this is now worsened by the crisis in Ukraine. The price of raw materials has increased, and developing countries have felt this even more. Indeed, access to resources is more expensive, and there is more poverty and displaced persons. And this will make the situation a lot more difficult for us all. And it's not good news for climate change in itself. So indeed, we need to rally everyone, and women are very important in this rallying for a better future for us all. And as you said, 26%, if women were more present in the decision making, we will increase GDP. So indeed, now I will give the floor to the next speaker, Mrs. Elback Zeinabou. We cannot see you at the moment. Here we are. I have often met her. We have a few exchanges. She was the Minister of Promotion of Women and Children in Niger, special advisor of the president, and was also the president of the organization. And I'm always delighted to work with her in Niger. Thank you very much for being with us today. And I would like to salute the new president of Niger. We wish a lot of success because the situation is difficult. We are really with you. Over to you. Could you please turn your mic on, Zeinabou? Zeinabou, have you turned on your mic? I think it's okay now. No, unfortunately, we cannot hear you.
Zeinabou, on ne t'entend pas.
We cannot hear you, Zeinabou. We cannot hear you.
Zeinabou, active ton micro.
Please turn on your mic, Zeinabou. You haven't turned it on. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you at the moment. If you could turn on your mic, please. What I would suggest Zeinabou, I suggest to go back to you later on once you have fixed this technical issue. I will, in the meantime, give the floor to Nesrine Rebai in Tunisia, gender expert. Oh, it's okay now? Can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the Socialist International Women. We are delighted to be part of this panel during the 66th session of the Commission of Women. Gender equality is a concept that we will not get back to now. We all know about this. Regarding climate change, we can say that Niger, my country, in the heart of Western Africa, and we can feel climate change on a daily basis in several forms that we didn't know before. There are strong rainfalls that destroy houses, roads, crops, kill animals, create floods, and lead to food insecurity. And the lack of rainfall as well are an issue for our crops. And strong winds as well are destroying our trees and crops. Hail as well. There's also diseases that were unknown to men and animals. And our main crops. And now, dusts as well that also have an impact on visibility and the health of populations. So how can we link gender inequality to disastrous climate change? We know that until now, this fight has been led exclusively by men. So now we think that the action of men isn't enough. There is such a danger that women need to be involved. We need to have relevant actions to fight against disastrous effects of climate change. The President of the Republic, Mr. Mohamed Bazoum, has a whole program that involves women in various fields, in actions of cash for work. These actions are in place with no discrimination. Women, men are involved. For mobile dunes, for the framework of GIZ projects, there are a lot of issues when it comes to the use of carbon as well. So we will form two recommendations. The first one is to recognize the contribution of women in the development of our countries, involving them equally on fighting against the disastrous effect of climate change, and make sure to have training and build capacity amongst women. We need to involve women in decision-making in the framework of the environmental policies in Niger. So these are our recommendations, but I wanted to inform you that we have two women, one of which is here with you, that can lead this fight, the Minister of Environment, who is a woman now. And I think Niger has got a lot from this. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zeinabou, for your contribution. In a lot of countries in Africa, climate change has important consequences that we can already see with the rainfall, floods, the appearance of new diseases, and indeed, involving women is essential, and gender equality is a necessity. So thank you for your recommendations that you have made to make sure there is more training, because it's a priority for the Socialist International Women to get better training for women so that they can be empowered and so that we can recognize their place. Thank you very much for mentioning as well that our Vice President also is defending women's rights and is very active at the Socialist International Women. And I'm delighted to hear that the Minister of Environment is a woman. It's very good news, and we will support her. And we hope that she can put in place the right policies in this field. So I will now give the floor to our friend from Tunisia, Nesrine Rebai, gender expert. And like I said, she will share with us her experience in this field. Thank you, Nesrine, for being with us.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président George.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. President Papandreou, Mrs. Chair, Ouafa Hajji, dear participants. It's a real honor for me to be able to participate to this event and be able to represent Tunisia and hopefully therefore contribute to the topic related to the relationship between climate change in general, natural disasters, and inequality between men and women. This issue of inequality in the face of climate change may be criticized, saying this is a vision slightly exaggerated because climate change has the same impact on women and men. Indeed, like all inequalities that appear to affect both genders, if we look closely, unfortunately, and as it's often the case, the situation is more critical in relation to women and girls. And this is how I'll try to demonstrate here that women are double victims of climate change, based on my experience in the field and with concrete examples. As I only have 10 minutes, I will be focused. I don't think we can talk about women without mentioning the agricultural sector. We know that the role of women in the agricultural sector is essential. 1/4 of active women in the world are working in the agricultural sector. According to a 2018 UN Women report entitled Turning Promises into Actions, Prospects and Challenges, climate change will reduce rice production by 15%, wheat by 49% in South Asia, respectively by 15% and 36% in sub-Saharan Africa, leading to a higher food prices and worsening food insecurity. Women depend on natural resources to earn their living. In recent years, and in the last decade, environmental damage is accelerating and moving very rapidly. Being a woman increases vulnerability to climate shocks, environmental and economic changes, even more in rural areas where livelihoods depend largely on natural resources, water, land, forest products, agriculture, which are highly dependent on climate hazards. The resources and options available to women to adapt to climate change are also limited by inequalities. So why? Well, first, I think I've heard that already. We should mention illiteracy, which is more frequent among women than men. Secondly, women are also underrepresented in the new technologies and engineering careers, limiting their participation in the management of innovation and in the field of climate change. Finally, economic power, which is very limited for women with less access to land and sometimes even a non-access to land and land ownership and therefore to credit. Let me take an example, banking organization and granting a credit. So in Tunisia, even if you want just a small amount, a microcredit, you need a guarantor. So even if a woman is working the land for years and would like, therefore, to be more autonomous and have her own project, these women cannot actually get this loan because they can't provide the guarantees. Women, because of the specific social roles assigned to them by society and discrimination we face, are impacted by climate change. And if we look at the recent studies, and Mrs. Hajji, you've mentioned that, despite the fact that women are here at the source, at the origin of 60% to 80% of the food production, they only hold 10 to 20% of land titles. So this is a contradiction. It's mainly women's work that allows the world's population to eat, but women are the most impacted. In Tunisia, the agricultural sector is, of course, very important. And, of course, when it comes to food security, and in a report from 2015, we saw that 1 out of 6 Tunisians still works in agriculture. And experts contribute to 11% of total exports. So if we look at the same figures, but for women, in my work, I was very lucky to meet many women working in agriculture, but also in the fishing industry. So in agriculture, it is discrimination from very early on. Very often they don't go to school, they have to support their families working home, and they have to walk here kilometers or ride donkeys for miles to bring drinking water to their homes. So even if in Tunisia we could consider ourselves lucky in relation to the access of water resources compared to other countries, still in recent years, things have changed and water resources are becoming scarce. And the figures on access to water due to drought are here alarming. This observation is confirmed by women. They confirm that the scarcity of natural water resources has increased their working hours and has had a negative impact on their living conditions. The situation, therefore, creates these double victims of an unequal system. Why? We're talking, of course, about economic violence, as they are underpaid, earning half or even a third of the daily rate of a man. So if a man makes 30 dinars, women would only make 10 to 15 dinars, so about 3 euros. And in the fishing industry, women who are clam diggers in southern Tunisia, who work in very difficult conditions. They start working at 3 a.m., finish at 12 noon to earn less than $1 per kilo. And these products are then sold 10 times higher. So I can't talk about working conditions here without talking about the transportation condition to get work, because you need to go to work. Very often, these transportation conditions are appalling in winter and in summer, regardless of the season. They travel without any protection, so they are very often victims of road accidents. So it can rain, it can be very hot, still they are exposed to all the weather conditions. It should be noted that since the adoption of a law in 2015 on women and children victims of violence, now economic violence is punishable. However, we haven't seen much implementation still. In the world, we see the increase of the frequency and intensity of climate disasters, floods, storms, and all those phenomena modify the cycle of the seasons. And the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction reported on a study of 141 countries, found that more women than men died as a result of natural hazards, and that this disparity was strongly related to the lower socio-economic status of women compared to men. In societies where women's place is restricted to the private or reproductive space, survival skills are taught more to boys than girls. And while access to climate-related information and education is essential, women are rarely here the recipient of this information. We need to take into account the fact that if 1 woman in 7 in the world is a victim of gender-based violence, this is going to be even multiplied in post-disaster situations, such as post-war situations. So the consequences of climate change can also lead the girls to drop out of school or to get married early. And women are generally left out of consultations and decisions also on post-disaster recovery actions. I would also like to emphasize climate change and health. Several studies confirm the greater vulnerability of women. Here, we know that there is the risk of death during the natural disaster, which is 14 times higher for women and children. So all those are very significant factors. And some more figures, if I may, before concluding here. Available studies confirm here that women are more vulnerable here than men, vulnerable to natural disaster, even more if they are from a poor community. More than 70% of those who died in the Asian tsunami were women. And in 2008, when Cyclone Nargis devastated Myanmar, 55% of the victims were women. So indeed, we can clearly see here the impact of climate change on women's health, particularly here on young girls and women. And of course, we talked about the pandemic, war, climate change. Climate change is just another challenge for women. And we need to take that into account when we implement actions to close the gender gap. I believe that within the framework agreement on climate change, We also have an action plan, the action plan of Lima on the gender. I think we need to continue promoting this idea. And we also have Article 7 insisting here that all the stakeholders should take into account these gender inequalities in their climate change actions. And I believe that altogether, men and women should work here to really promote closing the gender gap. And I believe women shouldn't be victims, but need to be part of this movement for change. They should also be better represented here. And women and girls play a crucial role, should play a crucial role in the fight against climate change. And I believe that women are underrepresented in new technologies, and their participation should be promoted to have a better management of innovation technologies in the field of climate change. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. I think you clearly demonstrated that women play a crucial role in the significant sectors of society, such as the agricultural sector. You've also mentioned the difficulties relating to access to financing. And this is a contradiction. They produce more, but they are underpaid. They face this major inequality in Tunisia. Of course, the situations you've very rightly described can definitely be shared by a lot of other countries, mainly in Africa. Zeinabou also mentioned the situation in Niger. And I think our situations are very similar. And you're right to talk about the training. Absolutely, and access to training and access to education in the field of innovation. And I agree with your conclusion. I believe that women should be actors of change and not victims of climate change. So you are right, women and girls should play a crucial role in the fight against climate change. And now I would like to give the floor to Isabel. First of all, I would like to explain that unfortunately Shazia Marri, the Vice President of the Socialist International of Pakistan, cannot join our webinar today. But also Luis Ayala, the General Secretary of the International Socialist, who should have been with us also today and unfortunately wasn't able to join us. So let me therefore give the floor to Isabel. Isabel, I don't have to introduce you. You are you are a senator in Chile, and your fight in Chile is very well known to all of us. So Isabel, let me just give you the floor. And I know that you will share with us some very interesting.
Thank you very much, Waja. Congratulations for this great panel. I want to express my regard to all my colleagues whom I've listened with great attention, great detail. I, first of all, would like to regret the situation in Ukraine, something that has been mentioned here before, the drama of this forced displacement of millions of people that, of course, affects mainly women and children. Once again, women are suffering a lot more than men, not just as we're seeing here with regard to climate change, as we're seeing here, but also because of the consequences of this climate change that is irreversible. And despite us countries agreeing on doing something to stop emitting GHG, the Earth would continue to rise its temperature. And even if it's just a little, 1.5 degrees, this will bring great consequences. And I would like to mention that here in Chile, this is causing important consequences because we are extremely vulnerable country. We've been in a drought period that already lasts 12 years, and mainly, as has been said here, it fundamentally affects in the rural world these small farmers and their economies. And right now they cannot subsist, they cannot live with this income. So once again, we can say that this affects the most vulnerable sectors. And among them are, of course, women. Thus, we need to act, as Ouafa mentioned, together, but we also need to work relentlessly because this won't stop, not just in Africa, but this will happen in other continents. And of course, this affects us all and in our country, not just this drought period, but forest fires and other adverse events. And the war is also having an effect on the rise of the prices in wheat and, of course, of bread. And these are one of our food staples in our country. And it's something that is highly consumed by our most vulnerable population. Of course, they said this will have an effect on country as ours because we import some resources such as oil and gas because we're not producers, and thus the rise in prices is one of the main consequences. Of course, this will affect most vulnerable people. So this economic development model that we have, at least in our country, where we exploit, but where we also have this great imbalance between women and men, how they are invisibilized, how they are not taken into consideration. And our president actually mentioned how much will our GDP grow if we took into consideration the work of women? And this is something that happens to a great extent in most of our countries. So what can we do to reduce inequality as a result of climate change? We don't want to further increase the gender gap. So how can we achieve this egalitarian and inclusive development where we, and more importantly, we can provide sustainable solutions over time? It is our responsibility to leave sustainable countries to the future generations. And so we cannot continue carrying or conducting business as usual. We cannot exploit our nature without regulations or without any limitations, because as we've seen, the consequences are suffered by the most vulnerable, among them women. So it's a very complex circle. And thus it is important to mention a report that talks about gender equality and climate change. It was conducted with the collaboration of the ECLAC and France, and there and the Framework Convention on Climate Change by the UN also extends a number of recommendations on the link between gender equality and climate change. I would like to very briefly mention two elements. One is the passing of the Framework Regulation on Climate Change. This is very important because we want to ensure the participation of most vulnerable groups, among them women, with this gender perspective. And this government, unlike the previous government, has decided to work on the ratification of the Escazú Treaty, the only treaty in the LAC region, to ensure transparency and the collaboration with environmental activists. And this could be also a very useful tool. These are some steps in the right direction, but we need to keep on exploring these multilateral agreements on environment and these recommendations that the UN has expressed on climate change. So we need to access knowledge, we need to access data, we need to access statistics, as our panelists mentioned, that further reinforce the link between climate change and gender equality. We need to focus on the census of each country to be able to include women decision-making processes in policies. And we also need to trust the capacity and the ability of women to participate in these processes. We also need to focus on funding sources and also to reinforce and ensure the access of women to funding options. This is extremely necessary, and I would like to finish by saying that I'm hopeful with this new government, because the government has defined itself as a feminist government where 14 out of the 24 ministers are women. So we have more women than men cabinet, but it's not about the number. It's about the orientation of this government. Defining itself as feminist means that the gender mainstreaming needs to be a priority, and I mentioned that should be included among all sectors and among all levels. And this is something that must guide all public policies so as to effectively work on gender equality, on integration, and end with these profound inequalities that have been part of our lives for too long. So I hope that together with the international legal instrument and with the political will in our country, I hope that we can do something to mitigate found inequalities that currently exist, and that we can also find an instrument that ensures our participation and that allowed design of cross-sectional policy that ensure full participation of women in all the areas, financially, economically, so as to contribute to a better society, which is our hope.
Thank you, dear Isabel. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you, because it wasn't easy indeed to win the elections. And I think it was due to the fact that you were together, working together to progress, and in the left, you were able to win together as a whole. And we have learnt a lot of lessons in that field, thanks to you. 14 women, 10 men in a government. It's a good balance, and I think it's great news. And like you, I am hopeful. It's a great example from Chile, and it's an honor for us. We are proud to have you with us, and proud that you are here today. Indeed, what you said is important. We cannot continue to do a diagnosis. We need to move to action. We need to be actors, both men and women. And what's important today is to be together. Solidarity is essential. And at the level of the United Nations, we need to work together and get results and concrete proposals, and to have an influence directly on the policies of all states across the world with proposals, but also the United Nations needs to become more aggressive, let's say, perhaps in the implementation of the recommendations. For several years now, at SIW, we have programs that move things forward, but I think that today we need more. And as the Socialist International Women, I think we need to have an even more important role in the implementation of policies and recommendations and proposals that are adopted at the level of the United Nations. Thank you very much for your intervention. And we all agree that gender equality is important for the future of our planet. Everyone insisted on the fact that it's important that women are involved in decision-making processes. And this is what we're fighting for, because if we're not there, if half of the population isn't there, this wouldn't be possible. So this is now the question and answer session. Julie, you were going to take care of this part. Were there any questions? Julie, any questions?
Nothing has come through just yet. So if everyone who's here, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A panel now, or you can put them in the chat and send it to the panelists. We'd be delighted to answer your questions now. So let us know.
Voilà. Alors, moi, j'ai une question aux panélistes.
I have a question for the panelists, if I may, to start while we wait for other questions to come in. So my question is, we have talked about a lot of subjects. Asia wasn't present, unfortunately, but we saw America, Europe, Africa, different perspectives, the Mediterranean, and we've seen similar things, but of course there are differences in various countries. The question I'd like to ask to you all and to George, who will probably be joining us, how are we going to proceed? Like Isabel said, how can we have an influence? How can we work as women from different continents? What can we do? And what do you suggest that we do concretely so that as the Socialist International Women, as an organization, and directors, what can we suggest and how can we do it together? Who would like to answer first? Or we can go one by one, perhaps. Christie, you could start, perhaps. Thank you. I think the financial responsibility needs to be managed by those who can deal with it. So I think these responsibilities are in more industrialized countries, and the consequences, however, are felt in countries that are already the poorest. So the populations will have to immigrate, and the industrialized countries have a tendency to close their doors and do not welcome these populations. So I think there's a type of responsibility for those who are the producers of pollution and climate change. There needs to be an international plan that would prepare this immigration, because this is inevitable for the populations. A number of people will have to leave their country. So there are investment programs that need to be planned already in Europe, for instance. We are open to Ukrainians. There's a lot of solidarity, and I welcome this. But for welcoming populations from Africa or the Middle East, the reactions are a lot more hostile. This is very unhealthy. And climate change and poverty is due to the behavior of industrialized countries. So I think at European level and at international level, global level, we need to do the preparation work for this, because it's inevitable, and we need a funding system that will absorb the costs following that. And if we can be proactive as well on the way to balance things, to avoid to worsen the situation, I think in terms of proportionality as well, we need to already have strong measures. And I think this is what differentiates us from the Greens. It's social justice is important. We need to take measures for the populations that are punished, environmentally speaking. And this is unacceptable. We need to say that indeed the environmental transition, it's a question of survival, but also it needs to be implemented by the question of social justice. And the fact that in Europe, for instance, we talk a lot about taxes. Some say we will tax some people, cars, for cars that pollute the environment, but not electric cars. So who can buy these cars? That's not the middle class or the working class or women. It's measures that we need to put in place. And I believe also that we could also think about the fact that women can have a dialogue amongst themselves to have a plan in place. I won't take up too much time. That's what I wanted to say for now. Thank you. Thank you, Christie. Isabel, did you have anything to add regarding this?
Well, very briefly, I believe Kirsty made a very important point, and we facing climate change, and we had to understand that this is the consequence of greenhouse effects that were produced by the richest countries in the world. I mean, they are responsible for over half of the greenhouse gases, and therefore they should contribute more, or they should finance the largest support, because they are the ones who are polluting and they are the ones who are causing climate change. And then they are responsible for supporting those most vulnerable populations in the world who are suffering the consequences of climate change. And I think that there should be an international collaboration so that each country can determine their own contributions as it was set out in the Paris Agreement, because every single country, no matter how small the country is, can do their part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well as to mitigate climate change. So we need to follow the guidelines set out. We need to follow the guidelines set out by the specialist panelists in the United Nations. So every single country can do their part to mitigate the greenhouse emissions effects. And as everybody very well said, we women had to raise our voices. We need to have participation, and we need to continue to highlight the inequalities that we all know exist, and inequalities especially affecting women in rural economies, in peasant economies. Access to water, women's very own livelihood is at stake. And we've seen the effect of all this, especially during the pandemic in Latin America, where we are dealing with very serious consequences because women's situation have deteriorated significantly. So we need to raise our voices, we need to demand our own involvement and participation, and we need to have a transversal approach and always keep in mind gender matters.
Merci Isabelle. On a une question.
Thank you very much, Isabel. We have a question from Morocco, and it's a question for myself regarding the Moroccan context with the pandemic repercussions and the issue of drought. For women in rural areas specifically? So Mrs. Iman Gamini asked the question, and I wanted to say that Morocco is part of the international context. COVID affected the entire world, and today there's also the Ukrainian conflict, as we have highlighted. So the crisis in terms of availability of raw materials, the inflation currently means that indeed we're in a difficult situation for all countries. In Morocco, indeed, this year, there's also the issue of drought. It's the first year of drought, and it's a big issue. There is a plan in place in order to reduce the impact for rural populations. But indeed, it's a difficult situation, especially for women in rural areas, Moroccan women in rural areas, because indeed, this year is a difficult one and it will have repercussions because indeed, there will be more vulnerabilities for women, and we will, as a Moroccan NGO or government or party, we will have to try to make sure we reduce the impact of this on our rural populations. And also, what will happen is that indeed a lot of the populations will move into cities. So we need to also have trainings, and a lot of jobs will be lost as well, and we'll have to deal with that and ensure solidarity. So that was to answer your question. So we received another question from NK, saying that economic empowerment is important. Do your countries have special policies and a framework to support women in business? Would anyone like to answer the question? Nesrine, perhaps?
C'est ça, si j'ai bien entendu la question.
In business, if I've heard the question well, is that correct? In the economic empowerment of women,
économique des femmes est important,
as it's considered to be important, and also
actions de politique publique qui sont menées pour les femmes rurales, etc. Est-ce qu'il y a aussi
for women in rural areas? Are there actions for empowering women? Is there support for entrepreneurship? Yes, in Tunisia.
Tu peux répondre en une
If
minute.
you could answer in 1 minute, because we don't have much time left. Yes, in Tunisia, we have a few strategies that are implemented, national strategies, and then there are at the level of various ministries. But yes, for a few years now, there's a whole program of support for the empowerment of women. And this project is in place, and there's a number of trainings as well, organized in collaboration with the Ministry of Women, Family, the Elderly and Childhood, and NGOs that also implement various programs. So I cannot sum it up in 1 minute, but yes, there are various programs that are implemented to support women to move towards empowerment. And also for the issue of violence against women in welcome centres, we try to make sure that we can support them through empowerment and economic support of women. I hope I have partly answered the question at least. Yes, thank you. If I'm not mistaken, I think this might be the end of our session, Julie, is that right?
Yes, thank you so much, presenters. We're going to hand the floor over now to Ouafa for some closing remarks. So over to you, Ouafa.
Estaba pidiendo la palabra Elback de Niger.
I was asking to say something, I think.
Sí, que la palabra a nuestra amiga de Niger. Estaba pidiendo la
I believe our colleague from Niger was asking to say something.
Zeinabou?
Okay. Zeinabou? Please open your mic.
Oui, c'est très
Is it
bon.
working now? Yes, it's fine. You spoke about the involvement of women in Niger. We have an organization that was created for those who want commercial documents to facilitate this. And we can now say that young people are very much involved and they can get the necessary documents for their business. Now, in the informal sector, women work in all different fields and various activities. There are women who are entrepreneurs. We have women in business, a lot of activities for women today when it comes to empowerment. So we have this national strategy as well for the empowerment of women, Ministry of Promotion of Women. They encourage activities to generate revenue, and women in Niger are rallied in the agricultural sector, small businesses. We have also an event, an international event for women on the subject. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zeinabou. I will check if there's anything else. Right. It is the end of this webinar. I would like to thank you for participating in this event. It was very interesting. We shared a lot of information, and I hope that the next meeting of the Social International Women will be in person, and that we'll be able to see each other and give each other a hug, to be together in person so that we don't have to be together virtually. Thank you very much for all the participants and for those who asked questions. Thank you to our interpreters who worked with us. Our webinar was recorded and you can find it on the YouTube channel of the Socialist International Women. Thank you, everyone. Thanks and goodbye.